"She doesn't belong here," the security officer said quietly, but the words carried across the polished glass room like a crack in still water, and Naomi Carter felt every eye shift without anyone actually turning their heads as the tall man in a dark navy blazer stepped in front of her, his hand hovering politely, yet firmly near her elbow, guiding her backward toward the conference room doors while the low hum of conversation from the 47th floor boardroom softened into something colder, something measured, something that reminded her she was wearing a gray housekeeping uniform, while everyone else wore tailored suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and the marble beneath her shoes reflected the skyline of downtown Chicago through the floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight cutting across the polished table where a dozen executives sat with tablets, leather folders, and crystal glasses filled with still water that hadn't yet been touched, and Naomi tightened her fingers around the thin blue folder she held against her chest, her heart steady even though her breathing felt shallow, because she had told herself before stepping into this room that she only needed 30 seconds, just 30 seconds to say what she came to say. But the security officer shifted again, blocking her view of the long table as he spoke in a controlled tone. "Ma'am, this meeting is restricted. Staff access isn't permitted right now." And Naomi nodded once, not arguing, not resisting, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "I understand, but I just need 30 seconds. And the officer offered a polite, rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach his eyes as he guided her another step back, the heavy glass doors only a few feet behind her now. And around the table one of the younger executives exhaled softly. Another glanced at his watch, while someone at the far end adjusted a silver pen against a leather notebook, the room continuing forward as if she were simply a brief interruption in a schedule measured down to the minute. And Naomi felt the weight of that silence, not hostile, not loud, just dismissive, the kind that quietly reminded her that people like her were meant to pass through spaces like this without leaving footprints. But she stayed still, her shoulders relaxed, her grip steady on the folder, because she had walked 12 blocks in the early morning wind before her shift just to make sure she arrived on time, because she had waited outside the conference wing until the assistants finished their setup, because she had read the names on the glass wall outside and recognized one of them immediately, a name she hadn't spoken out loud in years. And as the security officer reached for the door handle, preparing to escort her out with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown since stepping forward, Naomi lifted her eyes one last time toward the far end of the table, where Chairman Richard Whitmore sat slightly apart from the others, his silver hair catching the morning light, his posture composed, his attention fixed on the documents in front of him, and for a moment, she wondered if he would even look up at all, if she would simply disappear back into the service hallway and return to polishing glass panels and empty coffee cups while this meeting moved forward without her. But then something shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a pause in the rhythm of the room as Whitmore's pen stopped moving. And though Naomi couldn't yet see his expression from where she stood, she felt the stillness ripple outward, like the quiet before a question no one expected, and the security officer gently opened the door behind her, cool air from the hallway brushing against her shoulders as Naomi held her ground for just 1 second longer, her voice barely above a whisper. 30 seconds, sir. And somewhere at the far end of the table, a chair creaked softly as the chairman finally lifted his head. Chairman Richard Whitmore lifted his head slowly, not with irritation but with a quiet focus that caused the subtle rhythm of the room to shift, and Naomi Carter felt the change immediately as the security officer paused mid-motion, his hand still resting lightly on the glass door handle while the chairman's eyes moved across the length of the conference table before settling on her. And for a brief second the morning light reflected across the polished surface, casting a soft glow against Whitmore's composed expression, and Naomi stood still, her shoulders squared yet calm, the blue folder pressed gently against her chest, as if it were the only solid thing in the room, while around the table a few executives exchanged brief glances, their expressions unreadable but curious, because it was not common for the chairman of Whitmore Holdings to pause a meeting that had been scheduled weeks in advance, and certainly not for someone wearing a housekeeping badge clipped neatly to the pocket of a gray uniform. Yet Whitmore's attention did not waver, his fingers resting quietly against the leather folder in front of him as he studied her with the kind of measured recognition that did not feel like judgment. And Naomi noticed the faint tightening at the corner of his eyes, as though he were searching through memory rather than reacting to interruption, and the silence stretched just long enough for the sound of the city below to become noticeable through the thick glass. Distant traffic moving like a quiet current beneath the skyline. And the security officer shifted slightly, uncertain now, his voice lower when he spoke. "Sir," she entered without authorization. But Whitmore did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back a fraction in his chair, the leather creasing softly as he exhaled. And Naomi felt her heartbeat slow as she realized he was not dismissing her. He was thinking, and she remembered the first time she had seen that expression years ago in a much smaller room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, when she had been younger and far more nervous, when the stakes had felt just as heavy but in a different way, and she tightened her grip on the folder again, steadying herself, while one of the executives near the center of the table adjusted his glasses and whispered something to the woman beside him, their voices too low to distinguish, and the assistant standing near the far wall hesitated, tablet in hand, waiting for direction that did not come, and Whitmore finally moved, his hand sliding slowly across the polished table as he closed the document in front of him, the quiet sound of paper settling echoing faintly in the stillness. And Naomi noticed how even the smallest movement from him seemed to command the room without effort, as though everyone present understood instinctively that the meeting had shifted, that something unexpected had entered the carefully controlled schedule, and Whitmore's gaze remained fixed on her, thoughtful rather than stern, as if he were measuring something beyond her uniform, beyond the badge, beyond the reason she stood there at all. And Naomi met his eyes without challenge, her expression calm, respectful, her posture unchanged. And the security officer slowly removed his hand from the door, uncertain whether to continue escorting her out or step aside, while the sunlight moved slightly across the glass walls, brightening the skyline behind Whitmore. And for a moment the entire room felt suspended, balanced between routine and something quietly significant. And Naomi realized that her 30 seconds had already begun, not because she had spoken, but because the chairman had chosen to look up. The silence held long enough for Naomi Carter to feel the faint vibration of the air conditioning through the marble floor beneath her shoes, and she realized that every second she remained there mattered more than anything she might say, because rooms like this did not pause without reason, and Chairman Richard Whitmore's gaze remained steady, thoughtful rather than impatient, as though he were quietly placing her somewhere in his memory. And Naomi felt the familiar tension of standing between two worlds, one where she wiped fingerprints from glass doors, and another where decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars unfolded across polished tables. And she slowly lowered the blue folder from her chest, holding it carefully at her side, her movements deliberate, respectful, and calm, while the executives watched without openly staring, their curiosity restrained by professional discipline. And one of the assistants near the back wall shifted her weight slightly, tablet still poised, unsure whether to continue taking notes or wait. And the security officer stepped half a pace back, his posture no longer firm but cautious, as though he sensed that the room no longer belonged to routine procedure, but to something quieter, something personal. And Naomi drew a slow breath before speaking, her voice gentle but clear enough to reach the far end of the table. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting." And the words settled softly in the still air, not defensive, not urgent, simply respectful. And Whitmore tilted his head slightly, listening, his fingers loosely interlaced in front of him. And Naomi continued, "I would not be here if it was not important." And she lifted the folder slightly, not as a gesture of authority, but as a sign of purpose. And the morning light caught the edge of the paper inside, creating a faint reflection across the glass table. And one of the executives leaned forward just a fraction, drawn by the quiet confidence in her tone, while another adjusted his cufflinks slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. And Naomi felt the weight of the room, but did not rush, because she understood that speaking too quickly would break the stillness that Whitmore had allowed. And she added softly, "I only need a moment." And the chairman studied her face carefully, and Naomi noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the recognition beginning to form like a distant memory coming into focus. And for Naomi, That moment felt familiar, because she had seen that same look once before in a different building across town. Years earlier, when she had stood nervously in front of a long folding table during a community scholarship review, her hands trembling as she explained her proposal to a panel that included a younger Richard Whitmore, and she remembered how he had listened then, not with impatience, but with quiet attention. The same measured calm she saw now, and Naomi kept her expression steady, not assuming he would remember, not expecting acknowledgement, only holding her place respectfully in the room, while Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his chair moving just enough to break the stillness, and his eyes moved from the folder in her hand back to her face. And for the first time since she entered, something warmer flickered across his expression, not quite a smile, not yet recognition, but something close to both. And Naomi felt her shoulders ease slightly, because she understood that the hardest part had passed, not because she had been invited to speak, but because he had chosen to listen. Chairman Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, the soft creak of leather echoing in the otherwise silent room, and Naomi Carter sensed that the moment she had prepared for was unfolding quietly, without drama, yet carrying more weight than any raised voice ever could. And she carefully opened the blue folder, her fingers steady despite the attention of every executive seated around the table. The crisp paper inside catching the morning sunlight as she held it respectfully, not stepping forward yet, not assuming permission, and Whitmore's eyes dropped briefly to the folder before returning to her face. And he spoke for the first time since she entered, his voice calm, measured, and unexpectedly gentle. "What is your name?" And the question seemed to ripple across the table, not because it was loud, but because it shifted the balance of the room entirely, and Naomi answered without hesitation, "Naomi Carter, sir." And Whitmore repeated the name quietly, as though testing the sound of it against memory. "Naomi Carter." And for a brief second his gaze softened further, and Naomi noticed the subtle reaction from the executives, a few leaning forward slightly, others exchanging quick glances, sensing that this interruption was no longer routine, and Whitmore's fingers rested lightly against the table as he asked, "You said this is important." And Naomi nodded once, respectful, then took a small step forward, careful not to disrupt the stillness, and she placed the folder gently on the edge of the long glass table, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, and the faint sound of paper touching glass seemed louder than expected, and Naomi opened the folder, turning it slightly so it faced Whitmore without pushing it toward him, and she spoke quietly. "This document was left in the service corridor outside this room about 20 minutes ago," and one of the executives near the center shifted in his seat, glancing toward the document with interest, while Whitmore's eyes moved down to the page, scanning the top lines without yet reaching for it. And Naomi continued, her voice calm but clear, "I noticed something that did not seem consistent with the meeting schedule posted outside." And the assistant near the wall quickly checked her tablet, her brow tightening slightly, and Whitmore lifted his hand slowly, resting it on the edge of the document, his attention now fully engaged, and Naomi added softly, "I was not certain if it had already been reviewed." And the room remained silent, but the tension had shifted from curiosity to quiet focus, and Whitmore pulled the document closer, his expression composed as he scanned the highlighted lines Naomi had marked with a small paper tab. And Naomi stepped back half a pace, giving him space, her hands folded gently in front of her, and the executives watched him carefully, because they understood that Whitmore did not pause meetings lightly. And as his eyes moved across the page, the faintest change crossed his expression, not alarm, not frustration, but recognition, and he turned one page slowly, then another, the sound of paper sliding softly through the silence. And Naomi remained still, her posture calm, while the sunlight shifted again across the skyline behind him, reflecting against the glass table and illuminating the blue folder between them. And after several seconds, Whitmore looked up from the document and back at Naomi, and in that quiet moment, the room felt smaller, more focused, as though everything now revolved around the simple exchange between a chairman and a woman who had stepped into a place where she was never expected to stand. Richard Whitmore held the document in silence for several seconds, his eyes moving slowly across the highlighted section Naomi Carter had marked, and the stillness in the room deepened as the executives watched him carefully, Sensing the shift in his posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the quiet concentration that suggested he had noticed something significant, and Naomi stood with her hands folded gently in front of her, her expression calm, respectful, and composed, while the security officer near the door remained motionless, uncertain whether he should still be escorting her out or simply step aside completely. And Whitmore turned another page, then lifted his eyes briefly toward the assistant standing near the wall. Laura, was this version distributed to the board this morning? And Laura Bennett quickly glanced down at her tablet, scrolling through the meeting files, her brow tightening as she scanned the list. No, sir. The board received version 3.2 at 7:45 this morning. And Whitmore lowered his gaze back to the paper Naomi had placed before him, his voice calm but firmer now. This is version 3.4. And the words seemed to ripple across the table, subtle yet unmistakable. And one of the executives leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, while another shifted his chair slightly closer, their attention now fully engaged. And Whitmore tapped the highlighted section lightly with his finger. This clause was not present in the previous version, and Laura quickly tapped her tablet again, her voice quieter now. You are correct, sir. That clause was not included in the circulated documents. And Naomi remained still, her breathing steady, while Whitmore continued reading, his eyes scanning the language carefully. And after a moment he looked up toward the legal advisor seated near the middle of the table. Ethan, did your team approve this revision? And Ethan Cole blinked once, surprised, then leaned forward. Slightly. No, sir. We reviewed version 3.2 only. And the silence returned, heavier now, more focused, and Whitmore leaned back slowly, the document still in his hand. And for the first time a faint seriousness settled into his expression, not alarm, but recognition of something unexpected. And Naomi noticed the shift immediately, understanding that the room had moved beyond curiosity into quiet concern. And Whitmore turned the page once more, then carefully placed the document flat against the table, his fingers resting on the edge. And he looked at Naomi again, his voice calm but deliberate. You found this outside the conference room. And Naomi nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. It was on the service counter near the hallway. And Whitmore studied her for a brief moment, as though measuring the calm certainty in her tone. Then he turned his gaze toward the rest of the table. This clause transfers operational liability before the final review stage. And the words landed softly but carried weight. And one executive exhaled quietly, while another leaned back in his chair, processing the implication. And Whitmore added, if signed as written, this would change the entire risk structure of the agreement. And the room remained silent, because everyone present understood that even small changes in documents at this level could carry enormous consequences. And Naomi stood quietly, her presence still modest against the backdrop of polished suits and glass walls. Yet the folder she had carried into the room now sat at the center of the table. And as Whitmore lifted his gaze toward her once more, the recognition in his eyes grew clearer, as though he were beginning to see not just the document she had delivered, but the person who had chosen to bring it forward. The room settled into a deeper stillness as Richard Whitmore's words lingered over the table, and Naomi Carter felt the quiet shift in atmosphere as executives exchanged measured glances, their earlier curiosity now replaced by a more thoughtful attention, while the morning light moved slowly across the glass walls, reflecting faint shadows across the polished surface where the document rested. And Whitmore remained seated for a moment, his fingers lightly touching the edge of the paper as if weighing not only the clause but the circumstances that had brought it into the room. And Naomi stood quietly a few feet away, her posture relaxed but respectful, her eyes lowered slightly in deference yet attentive. And the security officer near the door shifted his stance again, no longer guarding the exit but standing aside, his earlier certainty replaced by quiet uncertainty. And Whitmore finally leaned back, exhaling slowly as he looked once more at Naomi, and his voice softened, no longer addressing only the room but directed toward her. You read this yourself? And Naomi nodded gently. Yes, sir. I noticed the language when I picked it up. And Whitmore tilted his head slightly, studying her with renewed interest, and one of the executives near the center spoke. Carefully. It is not common for staff to review legal documents. But Whitmore lifted a hand subtly, not dismissing the comment, but quieting the tone of it. And Naomi spoke calmly, her voice measured and sincere. I did not mean to overstep, sir. I only recognized that the wording did not match the summary posted outside. And Whitmore's expression shifted again, the faintest hint of recognition deepening as he listened, and the assistant Laura Bennett glanced briefly at Naomi, then back at Whitmore, sensing that the moment had moved beyond procedure into something more personal, and the city skyline beyond the glass shimmered faintly as sunlight moved across the buildings, casting a calm glow over the room, and Whitmore rested his hands together on the table, his posture thoughtful, and he asked quietly, "You said you recognized the language," and Naomi nodded once more, her voice gentle. "Yes, sir. The liability structure changed in Section 4, and it did not match the earlier draft summary." And the executives listened closely now, not dismissive, not skeptical, simply attentive, and Whitmore leaned forward slightly again, his eyes studying Naomi with greater clarity, and the recognition in his expression grew more distinct, as though pieces of memory were aligning, and Naomi remained still, respectful, not assuming familiarity, while Whitmore's gaze softened further, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow around the quiet exchange, and Whitmore finally spoke. Again, his tone calm but warmer than before. "You noticed something that others might have overlooked," and Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. "I only wanted to make sure it was seen, sir." And Whitmore nodded slowly, and the silence that followed felt different now, no longer tense but reflective, as if the room itself acknowledged that something meaningful had occurred. And as Whitmore looked at Naomi once more, the faintest trace of recognition settled fully into his expression, like a memory, finally returning to the surface after years of distance. Richard Whitmore's gaze remained fixed on Naomi Carter, and the recognition that had been forming finally settled into clarity as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in memory, and the silence in the room deepened again, executives watching carefully as the chairman studied the woman standing quietly beside the long glass table, and Whitmore spoke slowly, almost thoughtfully, "Naomi Carter." And he repeated the name once more, softer this time, as though confirming something to himself, and Naomi lifted her eyes gently, meeting his gaze with calm respect, and Whitmore's expression shifted, the faintest warmth appearing at the corners of his eyes. "You spoke at the Southside Community Scholarship Review," and the words landed quietly, yet carried unmistakable meaning, and a few executives glanced toward one another, sensing the shift from professional evaluation to personal recognition, while Naomi nodded gently, her voice calm. "Yes, sir, that was about 6 years ago," and Whitmore leaned back slightly, a subtle exhale leaving him as the memory returned fully. "You proposed the neighborhood tutoring initiative," and Naomi's expression softened just slightly. "Yes, sir, I did." And Whitmore's fingers rested lightly on the table as he continued. "You explained how small academic gaps become larger barriers over time." And Naomi nodded again, her posture still modest. "I remember you encouraged the program, sir." And Whitmore gave a faint, thoughtful nod, and one of the executives near the center shifted forward slightly, clearly intrigued, while the assistant Laura Bennett paused her note-taking entirely, watching the exchange unfold, and Whitmore's voice carried a quiet respect now. "You were working 2 part-time jobs at the time," and Naomi offered a small, humble smile. "Yes, sir, I was," and Whitmore looked at her carefully, then glanced briefly at the gray housekeeping uniform she wore, and the recognition in his expression deepened, not with surprise but with understanding, and he spoke gently. "You said then that opportunity is often missed because people are not seen." And Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. "Yes, sir." And Whitmore nodded slowly, and the silence in the room shifted again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective, as if everyone present sensed that the conversation had moved beyond the document, beyond the meeting, into something more meaningful, and Whitmore rested his hand lightly on the blue folder she had brought, then looked back at her, his tone calm, yet unmistakably respectful. "It seems you are still making sure things are seen." And Naomi's shoulders relaxed slightly, her voice gentle. "I only noticed what was in front of me, sir." And Whitmore held her gaze for a moment longer, then leaned back in his chair, and the subtle authority of the movement drew the room's attention fully to him. And the executives watched quietly as Whitmore's recognition of Naomi Carter settled not just as memory, but as acknowledgement, and the room, once prepared to dismiss her presence, now felt altered by the quiet realization that the woman standing beside the table was not simply someone passing through, but someone the chairman himself remembered. Richard Whitmore allowed the quiet recognition to settle before he moved again, his hand resting lightly on the blue folder Naomi Carter had placed on the table, and the shift in his posture carried a calm authority that drew the entire room into stillness, and he spoke gently, yet clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you for bringing this forward, Naomi." And the sound of her name spoken with familiarity by the chairman seemed to ripple across the table, and Naomi lowered her head, slightly in acknowledgement, her voice soft and composed. "You are welcome, sir." And Whitmore nodded once, then glanced briefly toward the security officer still standing near the door, and though he did not speak directly to him, the message was unmistakable, and the officer quietly stepped further aside, his earlier intervention dissolving into quiet professionalism. While the executives watched the exchange with measured curiosity, and Whitmore then reached for the document again, sliding it gently toward the center of the table. "We will pause signing until this revision is reviewed." And the statement was calm, yet decisive, and Ethan Cole nodded immediately, already flipping open his legal binder, while Laura Bennett began typing quickly into her tablet, updating the meeting notes, and Naomi remained still, her presence modest against the backdrop of tailored suits and polished glass. Yet the attention of the room no longer passed over her, and Whitmore looked back at her, his expression thoughtful. "Are you working in this building full-time?" And Naomi shook her head gently. "No, sir, I am part of the morning housekeeping team." And Whitmore studied her for a brief moment, as though considering the distance between her role and the clarity she had just demonstrated, and he spoke quietly. "You always notice details." And Naomi offered a small, humble smile. "I try to pay attention, sir." And the sunlight shifted again across the skyline beyond the glass walls, casting a soft glow across the table, and Whitmore leaned back slightly, his gaze still on her. Then he reached to the empty chair beside the table, pulling it out just a few inches, not dramatically, but with deliberate calm. And he said simply, "You may stay for a moment." And the invitation settled quietly, yet the significance was unmistakable, and Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward carefully, her movements respectful, and she stood near the chair without immediately sitting, waiting for confirmation, and Whitmore gave a small nod, and Naomi sat gently, her posture composed, hands folded lightly in her lap, and the executives watched with quiet interest the earlier assumptions about her presence now replaced by thoughtful attention, and Whitmore returned his gaze to the table. But the atmosphere had shifted permanently, the room now shaped by the quiet acknowledgement that the woman seated beside them had not only altered the course of the meeting, but had done so with calm integrity, and Naomi sat quietly, the sunlight reflecting softly across the glass surface, while the city beyond continued its distant motion, and within the room, the silence carried a new weight, one shaped not by authority alone, but by recognition. Naomi Carter sat quietly at the edge of the long glass table, her hands folded gently in her lap as the discussion resumed around her, and the executives leaned in toward their documents, their voices low and measured, yet the atmosphere remained subtly different, shaped by the calm presence of someone who had not been expected to sit among them, and Richard Whitmore reviewed the revised notes carefully, occasionally exchanging brief comments with Ethan Cole and Laura Bennett, while Naomi remained still, her posture composed, her eyes attentive yet respectful, and the sunlight continued to drift across the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft reflections along the polished marble and glass. And after several minutes, Whitmore closed the document in front of him and nodded slightly, signaling that the immediate review had concluded, and he turned toward Naomi once more, his voice calm. "You helped prevent a decision that deserved a closer look." And Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. "I only brought it forward, sir." And Whitmore studied her for a moment, then gave a quiet nod, as though acknowledging not just her action, but the character behind it, and the executives around the table followed his gaze, their expressions thoughtful, and Whitmore gently pushed his chair back and stood, the movement unhurried yet commanding. And as he rose, the rest of the room instinctively followed. Chairs sliding softly across the floor, and Whitmore stepped slightly toward Naomi, his presence calm and respectful, and he extended his hand, not formally, not ceremonially, but with quiet sincerity, and Naomi hesitated only briefly before standing and meeting his gesture, her handshake gentle and composed, and Whitmore spoke softly. "It is good to see you again, Naomi." And the words carried warmth without spectacle, and Naomi offered a small, humble smile. "It is good to see you too, sir." And Whitmore released her hand and glanced toward the skyline beyond the glass, then back to the table, and the meeting resumed with renewed focus. Yet the shift in tone remained, and Naomi stepped back from the chair after a moment, understanding that her place had been acknowledged, and Whitmore gave a small nod, a silent permission, and Naomi quietly gathered the blue folder, holding it gently as she turned toward the exit. And the security officer near the door stepped aside immediately, his posture respectful now, and Naomi walked toward the glass doors with calm, measured steps, the soft sound of her shoes echoing lightly across the marble floor. And as she reached the doorway, she paused briefly, not looking back, but simply standing in the warm morning light, and then she stepped into the hallway, the door closing quietly behind her, and inside the conference room. The city skyline reflected across the glass table where decisions continued to unfold, while outside, Naomi Carter walked down the quiet corridor, her footsteps steady, the light following her along the polished floor, and the silence that remained behind her felt different, not empty, but filled with the quiet presence of recognition that did not need to be spoken again.